A doctor cures an infertile executive, but what happens 9 months later shocks everyone. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Dr. Naomi Carter stood at the nurses' station of Boston Memorial Hospital's rehabilitation wing, her dark fingers drumming against the metallic surface as she reviewed the latest patient file. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the subtle bronze highlights in her naturally coiled hair, which she'd pulled back into a neat bun. She'd learned early in her career that neurosurgery demanded perfection, even in appearance. Another stubborn one, Regina, the head nurse, remarked as she passed by. "Good luck with this one, Dr. Carter." Naomi's eyes scanned the detailed medical history before her. George Walker, CEO of Walker Technologies, admitted, after a devastating car accident that had left him paralyzed from the waist down. 3 surgeries, minimal progress, and according to the notes, an uncooperative attitude toward rehabilitation efforts. She closed the file with a quiet determination. Difficult cases were her specialty. They had to be. As one of the few black female neurosurgeons in Boston, she'd fought too hard to get where she was, to let any challenge defeat her. The quiet hum of medical equipment guided her down the corridor to room 742. Through the glass partition, she could see him, tall frame propped up in the hospital bed, silver threading through dark hair at his temples, and eyes fixed on a laptop, balanced precariously on the adjustable table. Even hospitalized, George Walker emanated an aura of corporate power. "Mr. Walker," she announced, entering the room with practiced confidence, "I'm Dr. Naomi Carter, your new rehabilitation specialist." He barely glanced up from his screen. "I've had 3 specialists already. Save us both some time. I'll be continuing my recovery at home with private care." Naomi pulled up a chair, deliberately positioning herself in his line of sight. "I've reviewed your case extensively, Mr. Walker. Your injury pattern suggests potential for significant improvement with the right approach. But that requires your active participation." "Active participation?" His laugh held no humor. "Doctor, I run a technology empire. I don't have time for false hope and endless physical therapy sessions that lead nowhere." "And how do you plan to run that empire if you can't walk into your own boardroom?" The words left her mouth before she could soften them. It was a risk, challenging a man like George Walker, but something in his dismissive attitude sparked a fire in her. For the first time, he really looked at her. His grey eyes, sharp as steel, met hers with surprising intensity. "Direct approach, interesting." He closed his laptop. "But you should know that my condition has been deemed permanent by some of the best doctors in the country." "Then they weren't the right doctors." Naomi stood and moved to the foot of his bed. With practiced movements, she began a preliminary examination of his legs, noting muscle tone and response patterns. "Medicine isn't just about accepting verdicts, Mr. Walker. It's about pushing boundaries, finding new pathways when the obvious ones are blocked." Her fingers pressed against a specific point in his calf, and she noticed a slight muscle twitch, barely perceptible, but present. A spark of hope she carefully kept from her expression. Years of experience had taught her that premature optimism could be as dangerous as none at all. "I'm implementing a new rehabilitation protocol," she continued, making notes on his chart. "It combines traditional physical therapy with neural stimulation techniques I've been developing. The success rate is promising." "Promising enough to warranty my time?" His tone remained skeptical, but she caught the slight edge of interest. "That depends." She met his gaze again. "Are you willing to trust the process, to put in the work even when it feels hopeless? Because I won't waste my time if you've already decided to fail." A heavy silence filled the room. Through the window, The Boston skyline stretched toward a clouded sky, steel and glass, reaching upward with the same determination Naomi saw reflecting back in George's eyes. "Twice a week," he finally said. "That's all I can commit to right now. 5 sessions, a week minimum. Your recovery isn't a part-time job, Mr. Walker." She held his gaze, unflinching. "You can run your empire via video calls between sessions if you must, but this is non-negotiable." Another long pause. She could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, weighing options, measuring risks against potential rewards, the same way he probably evaluated business deals. 3 weeks, he countered. "If I don't see measurable progress by then, I'm out." Naomi nodded, allowing herself a small smile. 3 weeks. "But I warn you, Mr. Walker, I'm not known for failing." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her at the door. "Dr. Carter," she looked back over her shoulder, "you should know I'm not known for failing either." Something flickered in the air between them, a recognition perhaps of kindred spirits beneath their professional veneers. Naomi felt it like a physical presence, but she pushed it aside. She had work to do. Walking back to her office, she pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her best friend, Lisa. "New patient. Difficult case. Could use that bottle of wine you've been saving." Lisa's response came immediately. "That bad?" Naomi glanced back at room 742, where George Walker had already reopened his laptop, his profile outlined against the morning light. "No," she typed back. "That interesting." She didn't know then how those words would come back to haunt her. Didn't know that in less than a year, her life would be irreversibly entangled with the man she'd just met. Didn't know that sometimes the most difficult cases weren't the ones you found in medical textbooks, but the ones that found their way into your heart. Setting her phone aside, she pulled up George's medical records again. She had 3 weeks to prove herself, to help this man find his way back to walking. She couldn't afford distractions, couldn't let herself see him as anything more than another patient who needed her help. But something in her gut told her this case would be different, and in her years of medical practice, her instincts had rarely been wrong. George Walker hated mornings now. Before the accident, they had been his most productive hours. 5 a.m. workouts, breakfast meetings, strategic planning sessions. Now each dawn brought the same humiliating ritual, waiting for assistance to move from bed to wheelchair, pretending he didn't see the pity in everyone's eyes. Dr. Carter arrived precisely at 7, clipboard in hand. "Ready to begin, Mr. Walker?" The rehabilitation room was larger than he expected, filled with equipment that looked more like instruments of torture than medical devices. Through the windows, Boston's skyline seemed to mock him. Towers reaching heights his legs might never manage again. "First," Dr. Carter said, positioning herself in front of him, "we need to establish a baseline. Close your eyes and focus on your feet. Try to move your toes, any movement no matter how small." George almost refused, but something in her steady gaze made him comply. "Nothing," he said after a moment, "just like the last 100 times." Dr. Carter showed him a video she'd just recorded on her phone. There it was, a barely perceptible twitch in his right toes, his throat tightened. "The neural pathways are damaged, Mr. Walker, not destroyed. Think of it like a corrupted data transmission in one of your systems. The information is there, it just needs a clearer path." What followed was the most intense hour of physical therapy he'd experienced since the accident. Dr. Carter's methods were unconventional, combining electrical stimulation with targeted pressure points and movement exercises. "Tell me about the accident," she said during a particularly challenging stretch. "Rainy night, slick roads, a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, the end. And before that, what's your last memory of walking?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He remembered exactly, leaving the fertility clinic after receiving the final confirmation that he would never father children. The irony wasn't lost on him. In one day, he'd lost two of the most basic human capabilities. Board meeting, he lied. Nothing special. The session was interrupted by Jonathan Walker's unexpected arrival. George's younger brother strode in, all designer suit and perfect hair, immediately turning on the famous Walker charm as he introduced himself to Dr. Carter. "Please call me Jonathan. Mr. Walker is my grumpy older brother here." He pulled up a chair. "So what's the prognosis?" "The prognosis," George cut in, "is that I need to focus on these exercises without an audience." "Come on, George, let me help. Just like when we were kids and I helped you practice for baseball." "I'm not a child learning to pitch, Jonathan. I'm a grown man who—" He stopped abruptly, the words "who can't walk" sticking in his throat. "Fine," Jonathan finally said, standing. "But we need to discuss the Morrison contract. They're getting nervous about your extended absence. Send me the files. I'll review them this afternoon. You know, taking some time off wouldn't be the end of the world. The company won't fall apart if you actually focus on healing." "The company is all I have left," George snapped, immediately regretting the words as he saw Dr. Carter's hands pause momentarily in their work. After Jonathan left, the session continued in silence. When she finally helped him back into the wheelchair, her touch seemed gentler, though no less professional. "Same time tomorrow, Mr. Walker?" He nodded. "And Mr. Walker?" She waited until he met her gaze. "The company isn't all you have, but what you do have, including the ability to walk again, depends entirely on what you're willing to fight for." Watching her leave, George was struck by an unsettling realization. For the first time since the accident, someone had seen through his carefully constructed walls of anger and denial. Dr. Carter hadn't just been treating his legs. She'd been reading him like one of her medical texts, gathering data points from every reaction, every evasion. He wheeled himself to the window, staring at his reflection in the glass. The ghost of the man he used to be, strong, unstoppable, in control, seemed to fade a little more each day. But now there was something else too, a flicker of possibility he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the accident. Pulling out his phone, he cancelled his afternoon meetings. For the first time in his life, George Walker admitted to himself that maybe, just maybe, he needed help. And maybe Dr. Naomi Carter was exactly the right person to provide it, even if that thought terrified him more than he cared to admit. 2 weeks into George Walker's therapy, Naomi found herself staying late again, reviewing his case files. The tremors in his right foot had progressed to more consistent movement, but his left side remained stubbornly unresponsive. She rubbed her temples, fighting an impending headache. "Girl, you need to go home." Lisa Monroe's voice cut through her concentration. Her best friend leaned against the doorframe, still wearing her psychologist's badge from the private practice. "Across town. When was the last time you ate something that wasn't from the hospital cafeteria?" "I just need to figure out why his left side isn't responding," Naomi said, not looking up. "There's something I'm missing. Or maybe you're too close to this case. I haven't seen you this obsessed since residency." "I'm not obsessed. I'm thorough. Honey, you cancelled on me 3 times this week. That's not thorough. That's avoiding your life." Before Naomi could respond, Jonathan Walker appeared at the door, looking unusually disheveled. "Dr. Carter, it's George. The Morrison deal fell through. He's talking about checking himself out." Naomi found George in the hospital's courtyard. Garden, his wheelchair positioned near a fountain that burbled quietly in the growing darkness. "Your brother's worried about you," she said, approaching. "My brother worries too much. I've made my decision. The lawyers will draft release papers in the morning." "Tell me why you're really giving up." His head snapped toward her. "Giving up? I'm being realistic. 3 weeks was our agreement. I've shown minimal improvement, and meanwhile my company— "Your company will survive," she cut in, "but will you? If you leave now, if you don't see this through, will you ever forgive yourself?" "Forgiveness is overrated," He wheeled himself closer to the fountain, but Naomi noticed his hands trembling slightly. Sometimes we have to accept our limitations, like you accepted them after the first specialist said you'd never move your toes again. She moved to stand in front of his chair. Like you accepted them when they said you'd never sit up on your own. I've read your complete file, Mr. Walker. You didn't accept those verdicts. You fought them. So what's really changed? The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of running water. When George finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if this is all I get? A few twitching toes and endless hours of exercises that lead nowhere. What if— He stopped, swallowing hard. What if I'm just broken? Without thinking, Naomi knelt beside his chair, her hand finding his. His skin was cool against her palm. You're not broken, she said firmly. Damaged, maybe. Changed, certainly. But not broken. And if you'll trust me, really trust me, I believe we can make more progress. But I need all of you in this fight, not just the parts you're willing to show the world. His hand tightened around hers, and for a moment, the professional boundaries she'd worked so hard to maintain seemed to blur. In the dim garden lighting, his face was all shadows and sharp angles, vulnerability warring with pride. One more. Weak, he finally said. But I need something from you first. What? The truth. No medical jargon, no carefully worded probabilities. Just tell me, do you honestly believe I can walk again? Naomi knew her answer could change everything. A single word of false hope could destroy the fragile trust they'd built. But looking into his eyes, she also knew she couldn't lie. Yes, she said simply. I do. He held her gaze for a long moment, searching for any sign of doubt. Finally, he nodded. Then I'll see you tomorrow morning, Dr. Carter. She watched him wheel himself back toward the hospital entrance, her hand still tingling where it had touched his. Only when he was out of sight did she allow herself to acknowledge the dangerous territory she was entering. Professional distance was essential in her line of work, but something about George Walker made her want to cross lines she'd never even approached before. Back in her office, she found a note from Lisa. Dinner tomorrow night. No excuses. We need to talk about what you're getting yourself into. Naomi crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. She didn't need to talk about it. She needed to focus on her patient's recovery, on the medical challenges ahead. Everything else, the lingering warmth of his hand, the way his eyes had held hers in the garden, the flutter in her stomach when he'd finally agreed to stay, none of that mattered. At least, that's what she told herself as she gathered her things to leave. But deep down she knew Lisa was right. She was getting too close, too invested. And in her line of work, that kind of emotional involvement could be dangerous for both doctor and patient. Again, Naomi commanded, her hands positioned to support George's leg. Focus on pushing through your heel. 3 days had passed since their conversation in the garden, and something had shifted between them. George attacked each exercise with renewed determination, and Naomi found herself hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. I felt something that time, George said, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, like a current running down my leg. Naomi nodded, trying to maintain professional detachment as she manipulated his calf muscles. That's the neural pathway starting to reconnect. Your brain is remembering how to communicate with these muscles. She glanced up to find him watching her, his grey eyes intense. Quickly, she looked away, focusing on the task at hand. The rehabilitation room felt unusually warm today, despite the morning chill outside. Let's try something new, she said, wheeling over a standing frame. You've made enough progress with muscle control that we can attempt supported standing. George eyed the equipment skeptically. You think I'm ready? I wouldn't suggest it if you weren't. She positioned the frame near his wheelchair. You're Brother mentioned you have a board meeting next week. Wouldn't it be nice to attend it standing? A flash of determination crossed his face. With practiced efficiency, they worked together to secure him in the frame's support harness. Naomi tried to ignore how close they were, how she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of winter mornings. "On my count," she said, moving to the frame's controls. 1, 2, 3. The mechanism hummed to life, slowly lifting George to a standing position. His hands gripped the support rails tightly, knuckles white with tension. For a moment, Naomi thought they'd have to stop, but then something remarkable happened. His left leg, which had been resistant to treatment, suddenly twitched and firmed, taking a small portion of his weight. George's eyes widened. "Dr. Carter." "I see it," she said, moving closer to examine his leg. "Try to maintain that muscle. Engagement." She placed her hand on his calf, feeling the muscle response. In doing so, she had to step between him and the frame, bringing them face to face. Standing, he was nearly a foot taller than her, and despite the support harness, his presence was overwhelming. "Your left side is finally responding," she said, her voice professionally crisp despite her racing heart. "The neural regeneration. A therapy is working." "I never doubted you," he said softly. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Naomi knew she should step back, should maintain the proper distance, but she found herself frozen in place, her hand still on his leg. A knock at the door broke the moment. Lisa stood there, holding 2 coffee cups. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, though her expression suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "Naomi, we had a breakfast date, remember?" "Right," Naomi said, stepping back quickly. "Mr. Walker, let's get you back to the chair and end for today." This was excellent progress. As she helped him with the transfer, their hands brushed briefly. The contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with medical observation. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Actually," she said, "I think you've earned a day off. Rest those muscles. I'll see you Monday." She gathered her notes quickly, avoiding both George's gaze and Lisa's knowing look. In the hallway, Lisa handed her one of the coffee cups. "So," her friend said, "want to tell me what I just walked in on?" A breakthrough in his treatment. His left leg responded for the first time. And that required you to be inches." From his face. Naomi took a long sip of coffee to avoid responding, but she couldn't deny the truth in Lisa's implication. Something was happening between her and George Walker, something that went far beyond doctor and patient. "I'm handling it," she finally said. "Are you? Because from where I stood, it looked like you were about to handle it with your lips." "Lisa, I'm just saying, be careful. Men like George Walker are used to getting what they want, and right now, you're not just his doctor. You're his hope for walking again. That's a dangerous combination." Naomi stopped walking, turning to face her friend. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't spent every night this week telling myself all the reasons this is a bad idea? Then why haven't you transferred his case to another doctor?" The question hit home. Naomi had asked herself the same thing countless times. The professional thing would be to step away, to acknowledge that her feelings were compromising her objectivity. But every time she considered it, she remembered. The look in his eyes in the garden, the trust he'd placed in her. "Because I made him a promise," she said finally, "and I intend to keep it." Lisa touched her arm gently. "Just make sure that's the only reason you're staying." Later that night, alone in her apartment, Naomi reviewed George's latest progress. Notes. His improvement was remarkable, faster than she'd dared to hope. In another week or 2, he might be ready for parallel bars, the first step toward independent walking. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. Thank you for today, for everything, GW." She stared at the message, her finger hovering over the delete button. Instead, she found herself saving the number, even though she knew she'd never use it. Professional boundaries existed for a reason. She'd learned that lesson the hard way during her residency. But as she drifted off to sleep that night, it wasn't George's medical progress that filled her thoughts. It was the way he'd looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he'd said he never doubted her, and the terrifying possibility that she was falling for a man she could never have. The Boston skyline glittered through the rehabilitation room windows as dusk settled over the city. Naomi had deliberately scheduled George's session for the end of the day, telling herself it was to avoid interruptions. Deep down, she knew it was because these twilight hours felt different, more intimate, less clinical. Just a few more steps, she encouraged, walking backward as George gripped the parallel bars. His arms trembled with effort, but his legs were moving, actually moving, one halting step at a time. "Tell me again," he said through gritted teeth, "about the Morrison board meeting tomorrow." "You'll walk in using just a cane," she replied, maintaining eye contact as he advanced. "You'll stand at the head of the table, and you'll show them exactly why George Walker doesn't need anyone's pity." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Using their doubt as motivation, Dr. Carter." "Whatever works." She watched his left leg carefully as it took weight. "Besides, I've seen the company reports. Your remote management has been more effective than half your board's in-person decisions." He paused, studying her. "You've been reading financial reports." "I like to understand my patients' worlds." She felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Your progress accelerates when you're motivated by work goals." The last rays of sunlight caught the silver in his hair as he took another step. They were close now. Too close. She could see the tiny beads of sweat on his forehead, the determination in his jaw, the way his shirt pulled across his shoulders as he supported his weight. "Time for a break," she said, stepping back. "I can do one more length." Your arms are shaking. Recovery isn't just about pushing through. It's about knowing your limits. He lowered himself into the wheelchair she'd positioned at the end of the bars, his breathing heavy. "Somehow, I doubt you've ever accepted your own limits, Dr. Carter." "Call me Naomi," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "After 3 months of putting you through torture, I think we're past formalities." Something shifted in his expression. "Naomi," he said softly, testing the name. "Does this mean I get to be George?" "Mr. Walker is safer," she replied, but they both heard the lack of conviction in her voice. She busied herself with her notes, trying to rebuild the professional walls that seemed to crumble more each day. "Your gait pattern is improving. With continued progress like this, have dinner with me." The words hung in the air between them. Naomi's pen froze mid-sentence. "I can't. You're my patient." "I won't be forever." He wheeled his chair closer. "One dinner, to celebrate when I walk into that boardroom tomorrow. George." The name slipped out despite her best intentions. "We can't." "Can't or won't?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Both. I've worked too hard to risk my career over what?" His voice was low, challenging. "Over dinner, or over what we both know is happening here?" "Nothing is happening here except your recovery." The words sounded false, even to her own ears. "Then why did you research my company? Why do you schedule me for the last appointment? Why do you—" "Stop." She stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "This conversation is inappropriate." "Naomi," the way he said her name made her heart stutter. "Look at me and tell me you don't feel this too." Instead, she walked to the window, watching the city lights bloom in the growing darkness. Behind her, she heard the soft whir of his wheelchair. Approaching. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in this position." She turned to find him much closer than she expected. In the dim light, his eyes were dark, intent. "I should go," she said, but didn't move. "You should." His hand found hers in the shadows. But I think we both know tomorrow isn't just about walking into that boardroom. It's about whether I'm ready to walk away from here. From you. The moment stretched between them, electric with possibility. Then a noise in the hallway shattered it. Footsteps, voices, reality intruding. Naomi pulled her hand away. Get some rest before tomorrow. You'll need your strength. She gathered her things quickly, professionally, pretending she couldn't feel his eyes following her every move. At the door, she paused. Good luck tomorrow, George. She didn't wait for his response, letting the door click shut behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her heart racing. What was she doing? Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed to get here, she was risking it all because she couldn't maintain professional distance from one patient. Her phone buzzed. A text from George. Thank you for believing in me. For everything. She should delete it, should delete his number entirely, should request a transfer to another doctor, should do anything except what she actually did, smile at the screen like a lovesick teenager. Tomorrow would change everything. One way or another, George Walker would walk into that boardroom, and Naomi would have to face the truth she'd been avoiding, that somewhere between medical charts and parallel bars, between professional distance and twilight therapy sessions, she'd fallen for the one man she couldn't have. The city lights, blurred as she drove home, her mind replaying every moment, every touch, every loaded glance. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow she would remember her boundaries, remember her profession, remember all the reasons this could never work. But tonight, in the privacy of her car, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to say yes to dinner, to choose the heart over the head, passion over profession, to let herself fall, just for tonight. Naomi paced the hospital corridor, checking her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The board meeting had started 2 hours ago. No messages, no updates, just silence that stretched her nerves to breaking point. You're wearing a path in the floor, Lisa said, appearing with 2 cups of coffee. I could hear your heels clicking from the elevator. I shouldn't have let him go alone. Naomi accepted the coffee but didn't drink it. He's pushing too hard, too fast. Honey, from what you've told me about George Walker, I doubt anyone lets him do anything. Before Naomi could respond, the elevator doors opened. Jonathan Walker strode out, his face unreadable. Behind him, leaning on a sleek black cane but walking steadily, was George. Naomi's breath caught. She'd seen him in suits before, but this was different. The bespoke charcoal pinstripes, the perfectly knotted tie, the polished shoes. This was George Walker, the CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms and built empires. Their eyes met across the corridor. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, small, private, just for her. Dr. Carter, Jonathan said, reaching them first. You might want to check my brother's vitals. I think the board nearly gave him a heart attack. What happened? Naomi asked, her professional mask slipping back into place. They never saw it coming, Jonathan grinned. George walked in, actually walked in, right in the middle of Morrison's speech about temporary leadership. You should have seen their faces. And the deal? Secured, George said, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction. Along with 2 new contracts. He shifted his weight, and Naomi noticed a slight tremor in his left leg. You should be resting, she said automatically. Actually, Jonathan cut in, we're heading to celebrate. Care to join us, Dr. Carter? You're the reason for our success after all. Naomi felt George's gaze on her, heavy with unspoken meaning. I can't. Hospital policy. Of course, Jonathan said. Another time, perhaps. George, the car's waiting. I'll be down in a minute. Need to schedule my next session. Jonathan nodded knowingly and headed for the elevator. Lisa, who had been quietly observing, suddenly remembered an urgent appointment and disappeared down the hall. Alone in the corridor, Naomi and George stood in charged silence. You're favoring your left side, she finally said. Worth it. He stepped closer, his cane tapping softly on the floor. I did what you said, showed them exactly why George Walker doesn't need pity. I didn't say that to encourage you to overexert yourself. No, his voice dropped lower. What did you mean then, Dr. Carter? The way he said her title now felt different, almost teasing. She took an instinctive step back. You need to ice that leg and rest. No more boardroom dramatics for at least a week. Have dinner with me. George, I'm not your patient anymore. He closed the distance between them. The hospital officially discharged me this morning. Check your records. Naomi's heart stuttered. You didn't tell me. I'm telling you now. His free hand found hers, fingers intertwining. One dinner. No hospital walls, no medical charts, just us. She should pull away. Should remind him of professional ethics, cooling off periods, the dozen reasons this was a bad idea. Instead, she found herself saying, when? Tonight, 8 o'clock, I'll send a car. I can drive myself. A smile, a real one this time. I never doubted that. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent electricity racing up her arm. Then he was walking away, his gait steady despite the fatigue she could see in his shoulders. George, she called after him. He turned. Where are we going? Trust me. The elevator doors closed on his smile, leaving Naomi alone with the ghost of his kiss on her hand and the certainty that she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. Lisa reappeared, eyebrows raised. Well, I have a date with a former patient, less than 12 hours after discharge. I know it's a mistake. Do you? Lisa studied her friend's face. Because you're glowing. Naomi touched her cheeks, feeling the warmth there. It's just dinner. Honey, with George Walker, nothing is just anything. Lisa looped her arm through Naomi's. Come on. If you're going to make a potentially career-ending mistake, at least let me help you pick out what to wear. Hours later, standing in front of her closet while Lisa held up dresses, Naomi tried to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. She was a professional, a surgeon, a woman who had fought her way to the top of her field. She didn't get nervous about dates. But as she slipped into a deep blue dress that Lisa swore would make a saint sin, she couldn't deny the truth. This wasn't just dinner. This was George Walker, the man whose determination had inspired her, whose touch made her forget her own rules, whose recovery had somehow become entwined with her own heart. Her phone buzzed with a text. Car will be there in an hour. Wear something you can dance in. Oh, girl, Lisa said, reading over her shoulder, you are in so much trouble. Looking at her reflection, at the hope and fear warring in her eyes, Naomi couldn't disagree. She was in trouble, deep, dangerous, wonderful trouble, and for the first time in her carefully controlled life, she didn't want to be saved. The car delivered Naomi to an elegant brownstone in Beacon Hill, far from the restaurants she'd expected. A doorman guided her to a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Common. George stood at a grand piano, his cane nowhere in sight. He'd changed into a dark sweater and slacks that made him look more approachable but no less commanding. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. I thought we were going to dinner, Naomi said, taking in the intimate setting. We are. He crossed the room to her, his gait careful but steady. I just thought you might appreciate privacy for your first time breaking hospital protocol. Former patient, she corrected, though her pulse quickened as he drew closer. Former patient, he agreed, taking her hand. You look beautiful. The apartment was a study in understated luxury, hardwood floors, modern art, and a dining table set for two near the windows. A bottle of wine breathed nearby. Did you cook? She asked, noting the covered dishes. God, no. I had it catered. But I did choose the wine. He led her to the table, pulling out her chair. "I remember you mentioning you preferred reds." She smiled, surprised he'd remembered such a small detail from their sessions. "You've thought of everything." "I've had 3 months to plan this evening." He poured the wine, his movements deliberate and controlled. 3 months of watching you work miracles while maintaining professional distance. 3 months of wondering if you felt what I felt. "George, let me finish." He sat across from her, his grey eyes intense in the candlelight. "I know that timing isn't ideal. I know there are ethical considerations, but I also know that what's between us is real and rare." Naomi took a sip of wine to steady herself. "It could be transference. Patients often develop feelings for their caregivers during recovery. Is that what you think this is?" I think we should eat before the food gets cold." He smiled, accepting the deflection. They talked through dinner about safer topics, his brother's latest business ventures, her research projects, their shared love of classical music. But underneath every word ran an electric current of anticipation. After dinner, George stood and offered his hand. "Dance with me." "Should you be? My doctor gave me a clean bill of health." His eyes sparkled with challenge. "Unless you think she was wrong?" Naomi took his hand, letting him draw her close as a new song began. They moved slowly, his arms steady around her waist. She could feel the strength in him, so different from the man who had first wheeled into her hospital room. "Tell me what you're thinking," he murmured. "I'm thinking this is dangerous." "Why?" "Because I'm not sure I want to stop." His hand tightened on her waist. They had stopped moving, though the music played on. Naomi could feel his heart beating against her palm, where it rested on his chest. "Then don't stop." The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. His lips were soft but insistent, tasting of wine and possibility. Naomi's hands slid up to his shoulders as his tangled in her hair, deepening the kiss until they were both breathless. "Stay," he whispered against her mouth. She knew she should leave, knew this was too fast, too soon. But as his lips traced down her neck, as his hands pulled her closer, she found herself saying yes, to him, to this night, to everything they'd both been wanting. Later, much later, she lay in his arms, watching dawn paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. George slept peacefully beside her, one hand still curved possessively around her waist. In the growing light, she could see the scars on his back, from the accident, permanent reminders of how close she'd come to never meeting him at all. Carefully, she slipped from the bed. Her dress had landed near the piano, her shoes by the door. As she dressed, she caught her reflection in the window. She looked different somehow, less controlled, more alive. She should wake him. Should talk about what this meant, what came next. Instead, she wrote a note. "This was a mistake. I'm sorry." It was cowardly, she knew. But in the cold light of morning, reality was setting in. She had crossed every professional line, violated every ethical guideline. If anyone found out, the elevator ride down felt endless. Outside, the city was just waking up, street cleaners, making their rounds, early joggers passing by. Naomi's apartment was only a few blocks away. She could walk, clear her head. Her phone buzzed, Lisa checking in. Naomi ignored it. She couldn't talk about this yet, couldn't face what she'd done. Another buzz, this time from George. "Don't run from this, please." Tears pricked at her eyes as she turned off her phone. She had to end this now, before it went any further. Had to protect her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for. But as she walked home through the quiet streets, her lips still tingling from his kisses, she knew it was too late. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to who she'd been before George Walker walked or wheeled into her life. She just hoped she wouldn't regret it 9 months from now. 6 weeks after that night, Naomi sat in a sterile examination room, staring at test results that defied everything she knew about medical probability. The word positive seemed to pulse on the page, mocking her scientific certainty. "Do you want me to run it again?" Dr. Helen Chen, her colleague and personal physician, asked gently. "Twins," Naomi whispered. "How is this possible?" "He was diagnosed as—" She stopped herself. Even now, she wouldn't violate George's medical privacy. Sometimes life has other plans. Helen sat down, her expression concerned. "Have you told him?" "There's nothing to tell." Naomi folded the test results carefully, tucking them into her bag. "I haven't seen him since that night." It wasn't entirely true. She'd seen him on the news 3 weeks ago announcing a major merger. He'd looked powerful, confident, and completely unaffected by her absence. His text messages had stopped after the first week of unanswered calls. "Naomi," Helen's voice was gentle but firm, "you need to consider your options. And he has a right to know." "Know what? That the doctor he trusted broke every ethical guideline? That a man who was told he could never have children somehow—" Her voice cracked. "I have to go. I have patients waiting." But in her office, she couldn't focus on patient files. Her hand kept drifting to her still flat stomach, where 2 impossible lives were growing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd helped George defy medical certainty by walking, and now he'd helped her defy it in an entirely different way. Her phone buzzed. "Lisa." "Girl, where are you? You've missed lunch 3 days in a row." Naomi stared at the message. Lisa would know something was wrong the moment she saw her. Her best friend had an uncanny ability to read her and a very clear opinion about George Walker. Another buzz, this time from Jonathan Walker. "We need to talk. It's about George." Her heart stopped. Had George figured it out? Had he somehow learned about the pregnancy? But that was impossible. She'd only just confirmed it herself. She forced herself to respond, "I'm in surgery all day." His reply was immediate. "Liar, I'm in your hospital lobby." Naomi closed her eyes, counting to 10. She could hide in her office, send word she was unavailable. But Jonathan Walker was as persistent as his brother. He'd find a way to reach her eventually. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like descending into battle. Jonathan stood by the information desk, his usual polished appearance slightly rumpled. When he saw her, his expression was unreadable. "Doctor's lounge," she said before he could speak. "3rd floor." They rode up in tense silence. The lounge was mercifully empty. Most staff were in the cafeteria at this hour. "How did you find out?" she asked, closing the door. "Find out what?" Jonathan looked genuinely confused. "I'm here because my brother is running himself into the ground. He's back in physical therapy, some new doctor who pushes him too hard. He's working 18-hour days, making risky business decisions. He won't talk to me about what happened between you two, but whatever it was, nothing happened. The lie tasted bitter. We had dinner once. It was inappropriate. I ended it." "Bullshit." Jonathan's calm facade cracked. "My brother doesn't spiral like this over dinner. He doesn't check his phone every 5 minutes over dinner. He doesn't—" He stopped, studying her face. "Are you all right? You look pale." The room was spinning slightly. Naomi grabbed the back of a chair, steadying herself. Morning sickness, though it struck at all hours, had been her constant companion for the past week. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Naomi." Jonathan's voice softened. "Talk to me. Whatever happened, we can fix it." She almost laughed. Fix it? How? Could anyone fix this impossible situation? "Tell your brother I'm sorry," she said, "but this is better for everyone." "Better?" Jonathan stepped closer. "You gave him back his life. You made him believe in miracles again. How is walking away from that better?" "Because I'm pregnant." The words burst out before she could stop them. "With twins. And your brother, your infertile brother, is the father." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan stared at her, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that looked like wonder. "That's..." That's impossible. Believe me, I know. Naomi sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. I've run the tests 3 times. Does he know? She shook her head. You have to tell him. I can't. She looked up at Jonathan, letting him see her fear. His medical history was clear. If this gets out, my career, my reputation, everything I've worked for will be destroyed. They'll say I took advantage of a patient. Former patient, Jonathan corrected automatically. Then more gently, Naomi, this is a miracle, a real medical miracle, and my brother, he's wanted a family his whole life. When he got that diagnosis, don't. She stood abruptly. Please don't make this harder. He deserves to know he's going to be a father. What he deserves is to move on with his life, to find someone who hasn't violated every ethical code in medicine. She moved to the door, then paused. Promise me you won't tell him. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. It's not my news to share, but Naomi, he'll find out eventually. And when he does, running away won't be an option. She left him there, hurrying back to her office on shaking legs. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, trying to steady herself. In the mirror, she looked the same, but everything had changed. Her phone buzzed again. A message from the hospital board. Monthly ethics committee meeting tomorrow. Attendance mandatory. Naomi's hand instinctively covered her stomach. Soon, she wouldn't be able to hide this. Soon everyone would know that Dr. Naomi Carter, respected neurosurgeon and rehabilitation specialist, had crossed the ultimate line. But for now, she had patients waiting. She straightened her coat, fixed her expression, and stepped back into her professional role. She was good at compartmentalizing. She had to be. She just wasn't sure how much longer she could keep these particular walls from crumbling. At 4 months pregnant, Naomi could no longer hide behind loose scrubs and strategic positioning. Her twins made their presence known with a pronounced bump that drew curious glances from hospital staff. The whispers had already started. Who was the father? Why was the ever-professional Dr. Carter being so secretive? You need to take medical leave, Lisa insisted one morning, watching Naomi rush to the bathroom for the 3rd time. This isn't healthy for you or the babies. I'm fine. Naomi splashed water on her face, avoiding her reflection. Just a few more weeks until my transfer to Chicago is approved. Running away isn't the answer. Really? Because Jonathan called again yesterday. George is asking questions about my resignation. She gripped the sink, steadying herself. He's not stupid, Lisa. Once he hears about the pregnancy, he'll do the math. A knock at the bathroom door interrupted them. Dr. Carter, there's an emergency in room 412. Patient from your old rehabilitation program. Naomi's heart stopped. Who's the patient? George Walker. He collapsed during physical therapy. The world tilted dangerously. Lisa grabbed her arm, steadying her. You can't go. But Naomi was already moving, her doctor's instincts overriding everything else. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, giving herself time to compose her features, to push down the morning sickness threatening to overwhelm her. Room 412 was chaos. George lay unconscious on the bed, while his new physical therapist hovered nervously nearby. Jonathan paced by the window, phone in hand. What happened? Naomi demanded, falling into her professional role. He pushed too hard, the therapist stammered. Said he needed to match his previous progress rates. When I tried to slow him down... Out, Naomi ordered. Everyone out except immediate family. As the room cleared, she checked George's vitals. His pulse was strong but rapid, blood pressure elevated. Classic signs of overexertion. I tried to stop him, Jonathan said quietly. He's been obsessed with matching the progress he made with you. Wouldn't listen when the new doctor said he needed rest. Naomi adjusted the IV drip, her hands steady despite her racing heart. At this angle, her pregnancy was clearly visible. She saw Jonathan's eyes widen as he noticed. "Does he know?" she asked, not looking up. "No. But Naomi, you can't hide this much longer. You're having twins. Yes, I know." She checked George's pupils, relieved to find them responsive. "Your brother's stubbornness is going to kill him if he doesn't." George's eyes fluttered open. For a moment he seemed disoriented. Then his gaze focused on her, dropping immediately to her swollen belly. The silence was deafening. "How long?" His voice was hoarse. "George, you need to rest. Your body—" "How long?" She swallowed hard. 4 months. He did the math instantly. She saw it in his eyes, saw the moment disbelief turn to understanding, then to something darker. "Get out," he said to Jonathan. "Brother, out." Jonathan left, closing the door quietly behind him. Naomi busied herself checking monitors, though every reading was perfectly clear. "Were you going to tell me?" George's voice was terrifyingly calm. "I don't know." "Don't lie to me. Not now." He struggled to sit up. "You were running away. I heard about the transfer to Chicago. George, please, you need to lie down. What I need is the truth." His shout made her flinch. "Those are my children, aren't they? My impossible miracle children that you were going to take away without a word." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You don't understand. Your medical history, the fertility diagnosis, if anyone found out about us, about this pregnancy, you thought I'd expose you, report you to the ethics board." His laugh was bitter. "I've loved you since that night in the garden. I would have given up everything, my company, my reputation, all of it, just to hear you say you felt the same." "I did feel the same, I do." The words burst out before she could stop them. "But this isn't just about us anymore. These babies, they're medically impossible. The questions it would raise, the investigation into our relationship." "Our relationship?" His voice cracked. "Is that what you call abandoning me without a word? Hiding my own children from me?" She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The rejection hurt more than she expected. "I was trying to protect everyone." "No." His eyes were hard now. "You were protecting yourself, and I'm done letting you run." He reached for the call button. "Jonathan!" His brother appeared instantly, as if he'd been waiting just outside. "Call my lawyers," George ordered. "I want an emergency custody hearing the moment these babies are born, and get me the number for the hospital board." "George, no." "Yes." He met her eyes, and she saw both love and fury there. "You made this choice for both of us once. Never again." Naomi fled the room, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. In the hallway, Lisa caught her as her knees gave way. "He knows," Naomi sobbed. "Oh God, he knows." "It's going to be okay," Lisa soothed. But they both knew it wasn't true. Nothing would ever be okay again. Because George Walker had just declared war. Not for his company, not for his recovery, but for the children that neither of them should have been able to create. And this time, running away wasn't an option. The hospital chapel was empty, except for Naomi, who sat in the last pew watching shadows from stained glass windows dance across the floor. At 8 months pregnant, finding comfortable positions had become nearly impossible, but somehow the hard wooden bench brought peace she couldn't find anywhere else. "I thought I'd find you here." Lisa's voice echoed softly in the quiet space. "The ethics board is waiting." "Let them wait." Naomi's hands rested on her belly, feeling the twins move. "I'm done running from this." The past 4 months had been a blur of legal meetings and medical reviews. George had withdrawn his threat to contact the hospital board, but his lawyers had been relentless about establishing paternity rights. Every aspect of their relationship had been dissected, every medical record scrutinized. "He's there," Lisa said quietly. "In the boardroom, walking without the cane." Of course he was. George Walker never showed weakness, especially not now. Naomi hadn't seen him since that day in room 412, though his presence haunted every corner of the hospital. His lawyers communicated through hers, their love story reduced to cold legal terminology about custody arrangements and visitation rights. "Help me up," Naomi said finally. "These babies aren't making graceful exits easy." Lisa supported her as she stood, adjusting her maternity dress, navy blue, professional, armor against what was to come. They walked slowly to the elevator, Naomi's hand pressed against her lower back. "Whatever happens," Lisa said, "I'm here for you. We all are." The boardroom fell silent as Naomi entered. 12 members of the ethics committee sat along one side of the long table. Her lawyer occupied one end, George's the other, and there he was, standing by the window, looking exactly as she remembered and somehow completely different. "Dr. Carter," the committee chair began, "this hearing is to address the ethical implications of your relationship with Mr. Walker and to determine any necessary disciplinary actions. However, before we begin, Mr. Walker has asked to make a statement." Naomi's heart stuttered as George turned from the window. He'd lost weight, she noticed. The shadows under his eyes matched her own. "I'd like to withdraw my legal claims," he said quietly. A murmur ran through the room. Naomi's lawyer leaned forward. "Mr. Walker, we should discuss—" "No." George's voice was firm. "I've spent 4 months fighting for control of a situation that was never about control." His eyes found Naomi's. "I was angry, hurt. I thought you'd taken away my choice about being a father. But I was wrong. The choice was always yours to make." "George," Naomi whispered, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." He took a deep breath. "The truth is, we both should have seen this coming. You took a man who was told he'd never walk again and made him run. I took a woman who'd built her life on rules and made her break every one. We were impossible from the start." He crossed the room slowly, his gait strong and sure, living proof of their first miracle together. "These babies," he continued, "they're not a medical impossibility to be explained or a legal battle to be won. They're proof that sometimes the best things in life happen when we stop trying to control everything, when we just let ourselves fall." Tears slid down Naomi's cheeks. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know." He was close enough now that she could see the moisture in his own eyes. "And I never meant to make you choose between your career and our children, so I'm making it simple. No custody battles, no ethics investigations, just be their mother. Let me be their father. We'll figure out the rest as we go. The committee still requires—" the chair began, but George cut him off. "Dr. Carter followed every proper medical protocol during my treatment. What happened after my discharge was between 2 consenting adults. If anyone wants to challenge that, they'll have to go through every lawyer I can afford, and I can afford a lot of them." A charged silence filled the room. Then suddenly, Naomi doubled over, gasping, "Naomi!" Lisa rushed forward. "The babies," Naomi managed through clenched teeth. "They're coming." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and motion. Through it all, George never left her side, his hand strong around hers, his voice steady in her ear. When the first cry pierced the air, followed quickly by a second, Naomi saw the wonder on his face, the same wonder she felt. "A boy and a girl," the doctor announced, "both perfectly healthy." Later, in the quiet of her private room, Naomi watched George hold their daughter while she cradled their son. Both babies had his grey eyes and her dark curls, impossible perfections that defied every medical certainty. "I was so scared," she admitted softly. "Not just of losing my career, but of hoping for this, for us. Every time I let myself hope for something impossible, life taught me how foolish that was. Until now." George smiled down at their daughter. "Look what hoping got us this time." "I do love you," she whispered. "I never stopped." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "I know, we're quite a pair, aren't we? The man who couldn't walk, the woman who couldn't bend the rules, and the babies who weren't supposed to exist. What do we do now?" "Now?" He settled carefully. On the edge of her bed, their family finally complete. "Now we stop running, stop fighting, stop trying to control everything. Now we just live, Naomi, and love. The rest will work itself out." As if in agreement, both babies sighed contentedly in their arms. Outside the window, dawn was breaking over Boston, painting the sky in shades of possibility. Naomi looked at the man beside her, at the miracles in their arms, and finally let herself believe in the future they'd create together. Sometimes the best medicine wasn't found in textbooks or operating rooms. Sometimes it was found in the spaces between heartbeats, in the courage to reach for impossible things, in the simple act of letting love heal what science said was broken. And sometimes, just sometimes, the biggest miracles came wrapped in the smallest packages. Two perfect babies who proved that hope was the most powerful medicine of all. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.